So let's hook this thing up and make it work using JavaScript and AJAX. Now there's two ways to make AJAX calls. There's at least two ways to make AJAX calls using plain old JavaScript without a library like jQuery or something like that. There's the XML HTTP request, which is kind of the time-honored way that's been around for a long time. It uses callbacks, and it's got pretty much universal browser compatibility. There's also a new API called Fetch that uses promises. It's a little easier to use, but it's not necessarily as compatible going back even just a couple of years with browsers. So we're going to look at both methods so that you've seen them both and you understand them both. We're going to start with the one that's kind of more universal, which is XML HTTP request. So here we have this form, and if I go and look at that form in the code editor, you can see that it's just a simple HTML form. It has the input field, which is the zip field, and then it's got two more input fields that are lat and lon, right? They have IDs and names set up for these properties. And I've got a div down here where we can output some of that raw JSON if we want to, right? So it's just a ordinary form. It also uses, of course, it brings in a JavaScript file in order to do its business. So here's that JavaScript file, and you can see I've done a little bit here already, basically just putting in the get element by IDs so that we have a handle on those three input fields and what it is that those three input fields do. So in order to make this thing work, essentially, what we're going to want to do initially is set up some kind of a listener on that input field so that our actions will cause it to do the lookup. And in this case, what I'm going to do is simply add an event listener to the postal code field, and we're going to listen for the change event. What basically means if somebody puts a value in there and tabs away from it or clicks somewhere else on the page, that's going to trigger the lookup. We could just as easily do this with a submit button or something like that, but I thought for simplicity, let's just do the change event. When the change event is triggered on that field, it's going to call a function called getGeo. And so the next thing that we have to do is set up a function called getGeo and then put a bunch of things in there to make it work. So what is it that we need to do in there to make it work? Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is create an XML HTTP request and send that request off for a response. And then the second thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to set up a listener for the response so we can handle that data that comes back from the Maps API. So let's start looking at filling these parts in. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an XML HTTP request object. We're just going to call, well, let's see, if I'm typing in the right window, that would be better. Let's do var x equals new XML HTTP request. All one word. It's XML HTTP request, right? So that is how we start with our XML HTTP request object. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to open that request with a URL. So it's going to be x.open with a bunch of stuff in there. And then once we've set it up, it's x.send, right? So when we send that, that's when it's actually going to go off and make the network request. So if we go to XML HTTP request, let's look at W3 schools, and we can see the process is described right here. But basically, we create an XML HTTP request, and then here is the open API, and we can set a method like get or post. And then we can set the URL, and then there's some other things that we actually don't need to use. I'm actually going to go ahead and use get. We're going to set the get method. And then what is it that we're getting? Well, we're going to take that URL that we saw from Microsoft that needs a couple things plugged in. The method, the URL, and then is this asynchronous or synchronous? Right, we're going to make this asynchronous. Synchronous would mean other execution stops while we wait for a response, and we don't want to do that. So we're going to make this an asynchronous request, and then user and password are optional. That is the correct way to state this. So here is my URL, and you can see that I just need to plug in the key and the parameters. And the way I'm going to do that to make it easy is I'm just going to create a params variable, and it's an object literal that has two properties. I'm going to go ahead and paste those properties in, so you don't have to watch me type them, especially since one of them is the key. But basically it's the key and it's the query value, which is the value from the zip element in the form, right? This is a change handler on the zip input element. So this represents the input element, the value is the whatever was typed into it. So here we have a new XML HTTP request. We're opening it and we're sending it. That takes care of kind of the initialization of this query. Now then the next thing we need to do is set up a listener for the response. So this is going to be the XML on ready state change handler, and it's going to be a function in which we handle the response. And in this case, what we really need to do is check to see was the response successful, is the thing that we're looking for. Now if we go back to this documentation, we can see that the ready state property, as we described earlier in the video about cores, actually goes through all these different processes. The ready state thing fires a whole bunch of times for each request, and all of these statuses will come back from ready state until it's done and the response is ready. That's the only one we care about here, right? It's ready state 4. And of course we want the status to be 200, which is the HTTP status for a successful request. So the way we're going to do that is we're basically going to say this dot ready state is 4 and this dot status equals 200, right? So if these things are true, then whatever happens in here, we have a response that we can deal with in some way. Let me collapse some of this extra white space here. So what do we need to do in there? Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to set up an alert. Let's just see if this thing works before we get too far down the road. This dot response is going to be whatever we get back from that HTTP request. I'm going to set it up in an alert. This should be enough such that if I go to this form, reload the page, 02138, and we did not get an alert box. What went wrong? XML HTTP request is not defined. Oh, this is what happens when you type it instead of copy and paste it. It's XML in capitals. All right, uppercase. Let's try that again. 02138. And there you go. I get an alert box that's got this big honkin' JSON object that's not very useful to us in that form, but there it is. And in fact, I could go into the debugger and I could say on this alert line, I'm going to set a breakpoint. And let's say 02139. It sets the breakpoint there. And if I go to this dot response, sure enough, well, this is a string, right? And I actually want to be able to browse this as an object. So this is helpful. But what I'm going to do, okay, that can go away. Let's go to the editor. And what I'm going to do for convenience is I'm just going to set a variable called O, which is json.parse this dot response, right? So in this case, I'm going to parse this thing so that I can see it as an object because JSON is a string, right? That's what this dot response is. So by doing this, I actually create the ability. Let's reload. I actually create the ability to, let's do this one. O is undefined. I got to take one more step. Okay, so here's O. Let's make this a little larger. Bring it over. Here's our object, and now you can see it as sort of an object tree instead of trying to parse the JSON as a string in your mind. You can see all this stuff that's here. Here's the HTTP request, but here's our response. And now if we start drilling in, here's resource sets, which is an array. It only has one element. And here is its contents is an array called resources that only has one element. And then once we get down to that level, we start to see the things that we're looking for, which is, you know, like the B box and the name. And here is point. that has the coordinates, right? So if we think of this as just dot notation as we crawl down the object tree, we've got our object, then resource sets 0, resources 0, point, and coordinates is the array we're looking for, right? This is what we want to grab in our code so that we can plug the values into the form. So the way we're going to do that, in this case, I am going to paste, instead of having O be JSON.parse this response, we'll take out that, we'll take out the alert, and you can see we've created a variable that I'm calling L for location, and it is JSON.parse this response, resource sets 0, resources 0, point, coordinates, right? Coordinates should be an array that has 2 items in it because we saw them, well, of course now it's gone, but we saw them here a minute ago. If I do this again, take one step, and here's our O, and here is that tree that gets us to that point. Now, when you're using one of these APIs, this is pretty much what you have to do. You have to kind of look at it and poke around and figure out, how do I find myself to the level of the hierarchy of data that I want to be? And that's what we just did here. If you were using Google, it would be different. If you were using some other service, it would be different from this. The information's all kind of the same, but what that object tree looks like is going to be documented, but sometimes it's useful to see it this way so you can see what you're dealing with. So we now have L, which is JSON.parse, that path. And basically, all we need to do from here, and I'm going to paste this in. These if statements might not even be necessary. Pardon my clock. But all we're doing is we're taking the lat and lon input fields and plugging in the values from that coordinates array, the first value and the second value. And that is it. That should be a functioning AJAX call. I'm going to go ahead and close the debugger because I don't think we need it at this point. I'm going to reload the page, and let's put in 02138, and sure enough, we get our latitude and longitude. Now, I used this example with latitude and longitude to display this, but you could just as easily be extracting either using a different API or even using that API. You could be extracting city, state, country, and other information to fill in the rest of your form. So that's how to do this using the XML HTTP request.